This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, and this is episode 809 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, sponsored by FanDuel. Oh, what's up? Thanks for tuning in. Remember to check out lateround.com. Remember to also check out the Late Round Fantasy Football social channels on YouTube, Instagram, and TikTok. That's it. That's the intro. Short and sweet. It's a mailbag day. Let's get to these questions. The first question this week is from Cole on Patreon. It says, "Hey JJ, this is probably one of the many De'Von Achane questions that you're going to get this week. I know you have been higher than the consensus on him since the draft guide, and I happily scooped him up late in drafts. However, is it time to try to sell high while he's the hot new thing? I'm considering packaging him with Drake London to acquire Josh Jacobs." So first off, I think that package totally reasonable. I don't want my answer here to sway that and sway your decision. But I think when big performances happen, like we saw with Achane, the immediate reaction is to sell. But the vast majority of fantasy managers understand what just happened. They know that a team put up 70 points, that it was historic and unsustainable. So yeah, from the perspective of he's never going to do that again, Achane's a sell. If someone's buying that performance, trade him away. But someone buying that performance will mean that they would think that he's like a top 3 back in fantasy football rest of season. I did get a lot of questions about Achane this week, though. And there are definitely people out there who are concerned not just with Raheem Mostert, but Jeff Wilson too. Someone was even worried about De'Von Achane. The beautiful part about De'Von Achane is that he's always profiled to be an efficient back who wasn't going to see 20 plus touches a game. Instead, he's someone who could see like 12 to 15 touches, maybe a few targets, and he'd be strong enough in fantasy football still because of his speed, his ability, and his fit within this Miami offense. Fantasy Pros rest of season rankings among the rankers who have things updated, they have Achane at RB32, behind Alexander Madison, Jerome Ford, Najee Harris, just to name a few. At the moment, I have him 6 spots higher than that. And you could argue that he should be even higher. It just depends if you're in a spot where you need more of that ambiguous upside or not. That ambiguous ceiling. So just because a big performance happens, it's important to remember that fantasy managers don't always react irrationally. Hypothetically, yeah, he would be a sell, because he's never going to do that again. But I actually think that he might be more of a buy because people are still worried about this being a committee. To me, though, and this is where I was at before the season started too, to me, it's going to be a committee, yes, but De'Von Achane is a staple of that committee. He's not going to be on the outside looking in long term. This next question is also from Patreon. It's from BallGame4. It says, "Hi JJ, thanks for all your unique insights. Looking for your updated thoughts on Jaxon Smith-Njigba following a slow start. He was dropped. I've started strong and asking whether I should bet on his talent or if the peripherals suggest to stay away. Appreciate your thoughts." People are very, very down on JSN right now. And I don't agree with the general feeling and vibes towards him. He's played 3 professional football games. And he's played 3 professional football games while playing alongside DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett. And oh, by the way, he broke his wrist in August. I think with a player like JSN, people don't view his upside properly. Everything's essentially a median projection. And that median projection shows JSN on a team that's ranked 24th in the league so far this year and their rate of running 11 personnel. What that means is they haven't been throwing 3 wide receivers on the field at the same time at a very high rate. That's obviously going to hurt JSN. Because what this does is that Tyler Lockett and DK Metcalf, they end up running 8 or 9 more routes than JSN in a given game. So from a median projection standpoint, JSN is probably a flex play during the bye week period. I say flex play knowing that he's coming off his worst performance as a pro, where he had a 9% target share. But in his first 2 games, he was at 21% and 16%. It's not like he was unusable usage-wise. So let's just say that he has some flex appeal when bye weeks start to hit. And maybe that's only in deeper formats. What goes missing with this discussion is contingent upside. When you look across the league, most teams don't have two wide receivers as good as DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett. And of the teams that do, like Miami, let's say, those teams don't have a third wide receiver as talented as Jaxon Smith-Njigba. Look at Miami, for example. Jalen Waddle was out last week. Someone like Braxton Berrios may have become a more intriguing option as a result, but no one was rushing to the waiver wire to start Berrios because he's not a special player. So even with an injury to Waddle or an injury to Tyreek Hill, those additional players don't get elevated that much in fantasy football. Because at wide receiver, unlike running back, a wideout has to really earn volume. They have to earn targets. The talent equation matters more for fantasy purposes. They have to get open in order to see more volume in their offense. A quarterback's not automatically giving a wide receiver the ball if he's getting more snaps for an injured player. Whereas at running back, if an injury occurs to the RB1, the coach is simply saying, hey, RB2, backup running back on this team, you're on the field now. You're the one who's going to see the touches. Now think about teams where there's a talented number 2 wideout playing alongside a good number 1 wideout. Pittsburgh is a great example. Deontay Johnson goes down, and George Pickens, who's talented, steps up, and he has to be the top target for his team. His fantasy stock naturally goes up, right? Now that's not always the case, but Pickens' projection got mostly better without Deontay Johnson. He's now seen a 35% and 22% target share over his last 2 games. But regardless, in order for Pickens to hit that kind of upside, he needed that injury to Johnson. An injury to one player. That's the one player who would really help George Pickens in fantasy. And even with that injury, yes, his outlook appears better, but it's not dramatically better. Because he's already playing starter snaps. He's already on the field all the time in passing situations. With a player like JSN, he has more than one out. George Pickens has the Deontay Johnson out, right? Just like Treylon Burks, his out is DeAndre Hopkins getting hurt. Though I don't know if Treylon Burks would be any good because that offense is just so putrid. Courtland Sutton, he's been way better the last couple of years without Jerry Jeudy. These players who are their number 2 wide receivers, they usually have just one out to maybe hit that next level. But since a lot of them are already playing a lot of snaps, the uptick in their projection isn't overly significant, at least compared to a number 3 wide receiver like Jaxon Smith-Njigba. The thing that goes unnoticed with him is that his odds are twice as good that he can see that uptick. Because instead of needing an injury to happen to one specific player to elevate himself into being an every week starter, he has multiple outs. He has Tyler Lockett and DK Metcalf. What you should be asking yourself isn't only, will JSN produce with a healthy Tyler Lockett and DK Metcalf? You should also be asking, where would JSN rank rest of season if either Tyler Lockett or DK Metcalf got hurt? And I don't say this like I'm rooting for an injury. I'm saying this because football is a violent game. Injuries are inevitable. Whether we want to accept that or not, we have to factor that angle into our evaluation. So the way I see JSN is not from a median outcome standpoint. I understand the median outcome. It's that he's the wide receiver 3 on this Seahawks team. And the Seahawks team may end up being just average with their 11 personnel usage. I think they're going to run more 11 personnel with JSN getting healthier and getting more reps. But his ceiling is inherently capped with DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett there. That's generally where the evaluation stops, though, when it shouldn't. Because he has better odds to be elevated by injury than almost any other wide receiver in football. And if you believe in the talent profile, which is very, very important here, if you believe in that profile, which I 100% do, then he becomes one of the most obvious players to have on your bench in all of fantasy football. And maybe nothing comes to fruition. That's going to sometimes happen. What I'm saying is, when you make bets like this, if you do this over and over again, you're bound to then hit on players who see massive jumps in value from one week to the next. So if people are dropping JSN in your league, I would 100% be stashing him. This game of fantasy football is not about the median. It's about the higher end outcomes. This next question is from @GVLakers68. What the heck do we do with Justin Fields? I always talk about using your bench to sort of balance out your starting lineup. If you've got a weak set of running backs, then your bench should have a lot of running back darts. If your team is weak at tight end, you may want to roster more than one tight end. And that's how I feel at quarterback at times too. If your league currently has quarterbacks like Brock Purdy sitting on waivers, that's one thing. You can then get away with dropping a player like Justin Fields because getting him back if he blows up, it's going to be easier. Most teams in that scenario would be feeling okay at quarterback. That's why Brock Purdy's on waivers. But if your league's best waiver wire option's Desmond Ridder, then dropping Fields is a lot more difficult. You have to always think about that when you're making your add drop decisions. For me personally, if I had Justin Fields, I would not be dropping him. This offense is a mess. And people who are better at analyzing film than I am, they've been talking about how awful the wide receiver concepts are, how bad the scheme is, how this is not only on Justin Fields. Now, I think Fields has plenty of issues, but that should give us some hope. I'm not saying that Fields has been flawless, and I'm not saying that Fields is going to be great. I'm just saying that there are things in this offense that are happening that are not all on Justin Fields. Not only that, but look, I'm human. It's hard to just forget about what happened last year. Fields was a popular late round target in 2022. He was in my draft guide as a quarterback to target. And I looked stupid to start the season because at the beginning of last year, he scored 13.6, 8.8, 5, and 10.2 fantasy points. He was averaging 9.4 points per game from weeks 1 through 4. From weeks 5 through the end of the year, his points per game average, 23.5. Now, I don't think we're looking at identical situations, but as a human who naturally will find patterns in almost anything, it's hard to just ignore that. So if I have Fields, I'm not using him until I see something, but I do my best to not drop him. Just look at how insane his rushing upside was less than a year ago. This next question is from @JacobDeal_film. It says, when do you feel confident that breakouts are real? Like making sure Puka isn't a 2-week wonder or that Christian Watson isn't Chase Claypool. Well, first off, I never feel 100% one way or another. There's always room for outliers and weird things happening. But second, I would say that I ask these two questions when these breakouts happen. And you can do the exact same thing. The first is just simply asking how real the performance was. Was it fluky based on some big plays, maybe some broken coverage? Was it a great matchup? Or was the player actually good? You may have to actually use your eyes and do some evaluating, or at least listen to people who do good evaluation if you're not into that thing. There's always a marriage between the qualitative and the quantitative within this game. The second question I ask is if the player has a strong backbone of being a good player. The nice part about breakouts in the NFL is that the NFL isn't the first place that these guys have played football. If someone has gone years in the league without ever breaking out, and then all of a sudden they have a couple of big games, I'm not going to be that excited about that player. If someone hasn't played in the NFL once, and then they have a breakout game right away, I'm then going to investigate further to see what kind of prospect they were. So I'm combining two things. I'm combining how extreme the breakout was, how well they played, what their numbers looked like, and what they looked like when they were getting those numbers. But then I'm also looking at how they looked as prospects. When everything aligns, like a Zay Flowers, let's say, I'm going to be aggressive. I'm going to aggressively recommend that you have that player on your teams. When things don't align, like Josh Reynolds and how he started his season, despite never being a consistent producer in the NFL after playing in the league for 8 years, I'm not going to be as aggressive. Which, by the way, I'm recording this before Thursday Night Football. So Josh Reynolds may have gone off against the Packers. I have no idea. But I still stand by that process and overall idea. We knew what Reynolds was, and we know what Reynolds is. But by asking those questions, you should get closer to understanding if a player is for real or not. The last question is from @SS Giorgio. It says, streaming tight end has been so horrible this year. At what point do you consider paying a premium to acquire a top-end tight end? Even in a 10-team league, it's incredibly difficult to find players who are halfway decent. So am I alone in feeling the opposite is kind of true this year? But first, like I said this offseason, when you're in smaller leagues like a 10-teamer or an 8-teamer, getting elite players at onesie positions, it matters more. Tight end especially. because each team needs a really good roster to compete. Because every team across your league, in smaller leagues, every team's good. So that's the first thing that I want to say. Now, streaming is always going to be difficult at tight end. My other podcast, Living the Stream, we're usually in like the tight end 10 to tight end 12 range at the end of the year in points per game with our tight end streamers. Now, we don't have the benefit of picking a tight end up in week 1 and riding that player no matter what through the rest of the year. We're picking guys who are rostered in very, very few leagues each week. So when like a Jake Ferguson type sees his percent roster number shoot up, we can't pick that player anymore. So that makes it a little bit tougher. But pre-Thursday night football, you have plenty of late round tight ends and sort of afterthoughts doing work at tight end this year. And then you have guys like George Kittle, who's under 10 PPR points per game, Darren Waller, Dallas Goedert, Kyle Pitts. You have tight ends who people spent up to get who really aren't living up to expectation. The experience that you have right now at tight end is the experience that basically 80% of your league is experiencing. I say 80% because 2 of the 10 teams in your league have TJ Hawkinson and Travis Kelce. I won't say anything about Sam Laporta because, again, I'm recording this before Thursday night's game. But the rest of the tight end position has been pretty rough. Your goal with streaming, by the way, is to not stream forever. Hopefully you can use the recommendations that I've provided on this show to get more of an every week starter or get a couple of guys that you can pair together. If you're picking up tight ends and then automatically dropping them, that's not good process. I'm not saying that you're doing that, but I need to call that out. Don't automatically stream. But overall, though, remember to give this kind of thing some context. Most people are suffering at tight end because it's a total dumpster fire of a position in fantasy football. That's it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you yet subscribed to the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter @LateRoundQB. Thanks for listening, everyone. Got the Late Round Perspectives episode dropping later today. Otherwise, enjoy your weekend. I'll talk to you next week.